you go. Go for it.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. And we have a special guest here today, someone who's spoken before at China in the World when it was based at Princeton University, Francis Yaping Wang, who is an assistant professor at Colgate University, who just published this wonderful book, The Art of State Persuasion. And she's going to speak about this book today. She has taught in Singapore at the School of Management, and she's won a whole scad of fellowships along the way. And one of those fellowships makes me sad because it was a Minerva-United States Institute of Peace Fellowship. Both the Minerva program and USIP have been basically shuttered. But it's a really hard one to get. And she has lots of publications, and she's a real public intellectual in that she has published in, top rank scholarly journals like Security Studies, the Journal of Contemporary China, International Studies Quarterly, and she's also published in public venues like the Diplomat, South China Morning Post, and Independent. So she's everything that China in the World is trying to encourage, which is serious, rigorous academic work and engagement with the broad public. And she got her PhD from the University of Virginia with the estimable Brantley Womack. And if you don't know who Brantley Womack is, look him up, look at his writings. He is the leading expert in the United States, in my opinion, on China's relations with Vietnam. And China's relations with Vietnam have always been important back into the Cold War, and they are important. They are important again today in the tariff war. So being a student of Brantley Womack, Professor Wang is also an expert on Vietnam. So I'm going to turn the podium over to her, and please welcome her for coming here at a busy time in the semester, as you all know, and thanks for being here today.
Should we do something about that? Dan? Okay. And can everyone see the slides, or should we dim the light a little bit? Okay, sorry, Dan. Can we dim the light a little bit? Hello. Good afternoon.
That's the right answer.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks, Professor Christensen, for the kind introduction. I gave a talk at Princeton 6 years ago. Also, back then, the Harvard, Princeton, China, and the World program. Oh, yes, Princeton and Harvard.
Where I am is always first.
Yes, right. I gave the talk about a paper that was basically encapsulated the idea of my dissertation, and the dissertation grew and grew into this book. I'm happy to present the book here today. The book, with the idea first conceived during my PhD years, took shape as my dissertation, evolved during long trips to China and Vietnam, computer-assisted text analysis of thousands of people's daily articles. And so this book was published last year by the Oxford University Press. The project was, right, my clicker's not working. Yeah. This project was motivated by the curious variation in how authoritarian states in particular shape domestic public opinion on foreign policy issues. Sometimes they purposefully turn up the volume of a dispute. Other times they damp down or even muffle a dispute. Take the South China Sea dispute, for example. Before 2010, it was largely not a hot topic in China among the Chinese people. Many people like myself who grew up in China learning about the beautiful, sprightly islands and James Shoal as the southernmost point of the country through elementary school textbooks like this, with beautiful images and romantic language about the islands. But little did we know about the dispute between China and Malaysia over James Shoal, and the general dispute between China and 5 other claimants over the Spratlys and South China Sea was not on the minds of the Chinese people on a day-to-day basis. Until things changed dramatically in around 2010, when the South China Sea issue had transformed into one of China's most prominent foreign policy issues. fueled by an upsurge of nationalist fervor, thanks in large part to the deliberate permission and sometimes even encouragement by the Chinese state media. In 2016, for example, the Sino-Philippines arbitration ruling dismissed most of China's claims, including that of James Shoal. Chinese propagandists launched an impressive media campaign, bombarding the country with near daily tirades on both print and digital media. So this variation in China's or in countries' domestic media behavior on foreign disputes presents two related puzzles. First, why do states sometimes engage in efforts to make a previously unnoticed dispute more public? So I refer to this variation between highlighting and underplaying disputes, the barking dog selling dog puzzle. Second, if we dig deeper into what happens after the barking, many instances of harsh rhetoric remain mere rhetoric. They rarely turn into actions that some of these rhetoric claims to do. This raises the question, why isn't domestic mobilization always followed with a hardline foreign policy? I call this the barking without biting puzzle. This book finds out that the barking without biting scenarios are not only not only happening, but they're actually common. Going back to the South China Sea arbitration ruling, for example, after significant efforts to bring the dispute into the public eye through an impressive media campaign, Beijing, instead of adopting retaliatory measures, they extended an olive branch to the Duterte government. They not only adopted diplomatic gestures, but also conciliatory substantive policy concessions made to the Philippines. So this is very puzzling. Raises the question then, what explains all the barking but no biting? So the barking refers to the media campaigns, and the biting, the no biting, refers to the moderate foreign policy. So these two puzzles form the central questions that this book addresses. In particular, I focus on the barking, which I mean media campaigns, in contrast to the silence, which usually refers to censorship. And there are big literature on censorship, but not lots of studies that study the media campaigns, the opposite of keeping silent. I define media campaigns as government orchestrated, concerted efforts to attract public attention to a dispute by the use of mass media. They usually have to meet two requirements. First is the notable increase in the media coverage, usually by a dramatic amount in a short period of time. And second is the deliberate nature in that increase. So it has to have the government as the mastermind behind it. It can't be just media's reflective reactions to provocative events. So the governments are the mastermind behind these media campaigns. To give you an example, here are some snapshots of People's Daily, the most authoritative newspaper in China, during the 2012 diplomatic crisis between China and Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. The circled articles are all front page articles in a short week. Once a campaign like this is launched, it's almost like a deafening crescendo. If you're in China, it's really hard for anyone to miss. So the book, in tackling the first puzzle, tries to explain why media campaigns occur, the favorable conditions leading to their adoption, and the subjective motivations driving them. In tackling the second puzzle, I describe how media campaigns look and work. In other words, their appearances and mechanics of the media campaigns. Understanding these media campaigns is important for several reasons. First, we have relatively little or really simplistic understandings of them. We tend to think aggressive rhetoric means aggressive intention. But as this book points out, it's not true. Second, authoritarian states engage in some of the most dangerous foreign disputes, international disputes today. Ukraine, South China Sea, Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. As much as the domestic survival matters to these authoritarian leaders, which we know means the world to them, maintaining peace requires a better understanding of their domestic constraints and motivations. Third, understanding authoritarian politics through the lens of media and foreign policy contributes not only to IR theories, but also to comparative literatures on authoritarian public opinion and authoritarian resilience, which have growing significance today as we witness a wave of rising authoritarianism in world politics today. Last, but not the least, this issue carries important security implications for the United States and other countries around the world. The last Trump administration's national security strategy warns specifically about China's and Russia's use of propaganda to repress information, control information, repress their societies, and expand their influence. These low-cost, low-risk influence campaigns are also stressed in the CIA's and the DoD's official documents. Here's an overview of the structure of the book to provide a broader context for this talk. After the introduction chapter, I delineate a theory that explains the two puzzles that I've just described. And then I situate the theory in the context of Chinese propaganda system and Chinese media campaigns with a Mediaman test that includes 21 Chinese diplomatic crises on China's territorial disputes to evaluate the overall plausibility of the theory. And then I situate I test the theory, chapter 3 to 5, test the theory in detailed case analysis, including 4 cases, each in one of the theoretical scenarios, which I'll describe shortly. These 4 cases include the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese border war, the 2014 Sino-Vietnamese oil rig crisis in the South China Sea, the cable cutting incidents also between China and Vietnam around the year 2011, and the Sino-Philippines arbitration case in 2016. Chapter 6 compares between 2 different types of media campaigns, which I call mobilization campaigns and pacification campaigns, through computer-assisted text analysis. And this chapter is a new chapter from my dissertation that was added to the book that I can talk about this more in our Q&A session. And then chapter 7 extends the argument to other authoritarian states such as Vietnam.
Can you say the difference between a mobilization campaign and a pacification? Because I know from your book, can you tell them what the difference is between a mobilization campaign and pacification?
Which I'll get to.
Okay, all right.
When I get to the theory.
Okay, all right.
Yes. And then, so in,
That's my favorite.
okay, right. So in the remainder of this presentation, I will first describe the theory and then provide a brief overview of the Mediaman study before delving into a case study that illustrates how a pacification campaign would work, the 2016 Sino-Philippines arbitration case. So back to the central questions of the book, what explains or what motivates states to adopt these media campaigns? I argue that these media campaigns are a strategic state action in response to the misalignment between 2 conditions, state foreign policy intent and existing public opinion. State foreign policy intent is a state's intended foreign policy against a foreign rival in a diplomatic crisis. It can be characterized as hardline or moderate. Hardline involves the unprovoked threat, display or use of force, or economic sanctions, or when provoked, escalated responses. Moderate, especially on a territorial dispute, usually involves making territorial concessions or shelving a dispute to be resolved later, or when provoked, passive and proportionate responses. Because on a territorial dispute, you want to maintain your claim. So you have to respond, but proportionate and passive responses. Existing public opinion is the public's policy preference against a foreign rival in a diplomatic crisis before a state responds, so that it is existing. So the cutoff timeline is the onset of a crisis. And I followed the same definition of the state's policy preference of hardline and moderate, and I added a weak public opinion dimension and combined it with the moderate foreign policy preference. Weak public opinion refers when the public does not know much or cares strongly about a dispute. And I argue that these media campaigns are adopted when these 2 conditions are misaligned with each other. And the type of media campaigns, mobilization or pacification, is determined by the nature of that misalignment. So in this 2x2 table, the state and the public's policy preference form 4 different combinations representing 4 different scenarios. 2 misalignment scenarios that can explain these can motivate these media campaigns, and 2 alignment scenarios that can explain their absence. I'm going to talk about these 2 misalignment scenarios in detail next. In the shaded quadrant, the state policy preference can be either more hardline than public opinion in case A, or more moderate than public opinion in case B. In case A, when we have an existing moderate or weak public opinion, meaning that the public prefers a moderate foreign policy or does not know much or care strongly about a dispute, yet the state prefers a hardline foreign policy. So we have a misalignment. The state would mobilize the public, prepare the public, and mobilize the public for their support for a hardline foreign policy. The mobilizing rationale is pretty intuitive, as a hardline foreign policy would raise the probability of conflict, and conflict requires the human and material resources of the nation. But if the public does not care or prefers a moderate foreign policy, the state would need to mobilize the public first before they carry out a hardline foreign policy. Now, the importance of domestic mobilization on foreign policy issues has been argued amply elsewhere. But here, I'm extending the argument to authoritarian states. The underlying assumption is that authoritarian leaders care about public opinion. But they also only care about public opinion only to a limited extent, because they also have the ways and means to influence it to their likes. This is not to say that they are always successful. Their ability to affect public opinion actually varies from case to case. But the overall public state society relationship, as described here, is supported by many studies on authoritarian public opinion, and is common in many contemporary authoritarian states. And in case B, when we have an existing hardline public opinion, yet the state prefers a moderate foreign policy, the state would counterintuitively also launch a seemingly aggressive media campaign, but in this case, actually to pacify public opinion. Because this contradicts our traditional understanding of aggressive foreign propaganda, this deserves our special attention as to how a pacification campaign works, or how seemingly aggressive media campaign can actually pacify public opinion. So I argue that pacification campaigns pacify in a series of soft manipulations. In the first group of these soft manipulation techniques, the state media works to connect with the audience, so to build the trust and empathy that's necessary for effective persuasion later on. So the media campaign helps the state to dictate the discourse the moment news breaks, flooding the narrative with authoritative information within the first hour. This gives information advantage to the state media versus alternative sources. And the state media campaign also echoes public sentiment by resonating with their feelings. It's like when you're trying to get to your friend who's mad with you, who's mad about you. If you flat out deny their emotions, you're not going to achieve anything, but to further alienate them, right? But if instead you say, I feel for you, I share your feelings, you're more likely to shorten the psychological distance between you and your audience. So building the trust and empathy that's necessary for effective persuasion. And hardline posturing refers to keeping up the appearances of hard stance. This is important because a moderate foreign policy is usually equated as weakness or failure, especially in authoritarian countries where there's rising nationalism. So the state will utilize this appearance of hard stance to fend out these nationalist criticism, preserve their dignity, and maintain social stability. So this first step is really important. And the second group of these techniques works to change opinions. This is where the actual persuasion takes place, to neutralize the negative frames that were necessary for echoing and hardline posturing. The state media adopts a particularly positive frames, so that to show a calm and rational foreign policy should be the way to go, right? To pave the way for a moderate foreign policy to prevail. And then the media campaign also delegitimizes unhelpful emotions, especially anger and hatred. You relate the emotional foundations for social activism, especially violence. And lastly, the media campaign also makes sure that people have an outlet to let out their steam. So usually through social media platforms that they can let out their frustrations. At the end of the day, this media campaign, including these outlets to let people vent, helps to make them calm by the end of the day and agree, at least turn a blind eye to a moderate foreign policy by the end of the day. In these smart ways, a pacification campaign actually releases the public pressure on a state for an aggressive foreign policy it does not desire. So by the end of the day, a moderate foreign policy could eventually prevail. I first tested the misalignment theory in a Medium study in 21 Chinese diplomatic crises situated along 6 unique Chinese territorial disputes. These 21 cases are the population of Chinese diplomatic crises on China's territorial disputes. And here's a list of the countries that China has these disputes with, the type of the disputed territory, and their year of occurrence. Out of these 21 cases, China embarked on media campaigns in 14 instances. And in consideration of time, I will only present a key finding from the Medium study. This table shows the average monthly numbers of People's Daily articles. So the shaded quadrants, the numbers in the shaded quadrants are the monthly averages of People's Daily articles in the misaligned cases, averages. And then the unshaded numbers are the averages of aligned cases. So there are 2 numbers in each quadrant. The first numbers are the monthly averages of front page articles, indicating the salience of the coverage. And the second numbers are the monthly averages of all relevant articles, indicating the volume of the coverage. Because my study is medium, there's only 21 cases, so I'm not claiming for an average effect. But still, you can see substantially larger numbers in the shaded quadrants in the misaligned cases compared to the aligned cases, suggesting a strong pattern that People's Daily tend to be a lot more vocal when existing public opinion diverges from the preferred state foreign policy. Now, let me shift to a case study, the 2016 Sino-Philippines arbitration case, to illustrate how would a pacification campaign works. Here is a timeline of the case. January 22nd, 2013, the Philippines government initiated arbitration against China concerning the maritime rights in the South China Sea. 1 month later, China rejected the case and responded that it would not accept nor participate in the case. As the case dragged down, despite Beijing's repeated protests, a negative ruling became likely and imminent when the tribunal court announced its plan in June 2016 to release the ruling in a month's time. This spurred a diplomatic crisis. And in a month's time, as scheduled, ruling was released largely in favor of the Philippines and against China. But shortly after the release of the ruling, the 2 countries, China and the Philippines, worked together to repair the bilateral relationship. What was notable is that in June and July of 2016, Chinese government initiated an impressive media campaign on the dispute. So this is a time series line plot of People's Daily coverage between the years 2010 and 2016. 2017. You can see that there's a massive spike in People's Daily coverage in June, July of 2016. In a short period of 61 days, roughly 2 months, a total of 206 articles on People's Daily were published, 9 of which appear in the front pages. This averages to 4 to 5 front page articles and over 100 articles on the dispute. So back to the definition of media campaign. There's not only a notable increase in the media coverage, but we also have evidence that this media campaign was well deliberated by the top Chinese leadership and well coordinated. These are internal notes circulated. These were leaked by Chinese journalists or editors to me during my interviews. That note circulated among all major Chinese state media, called the editors to follow the party central committee's directives and fight well this public opinion battle. Another note circulated on July 13th, right before the release of the ruling, called the editors to follow the leadership's command and the previously prepared reporting plan. So this media campaign is remarkable in the sense that we know that China's traditional approach on the South China Sea being low profile. So they first launched a media campaign and reversed this longstanding low profile approach on the South China Sea issue, drew extra attention to a case that they presumably anticipated losing because there's a long leading up time. And to top it all, after the release of the ruling, they added to it a moderate foreign policy. So all of this are quite contradictory and confusing. The center of the puzzle is what explains all the barking, the media campaign, the no biting, the moderate foreign policy that follows after that. So I argue this is a result of the misalignment between existing hardline public opinion and a moderate state foreign policy intent. Public opinion had already been hardline by the onset of the crisis due to China's land reclamation activities and U.S. freedom navigation operations in the South China Sea throughout the year 2015 and the first half of 2016. Both of these activities were highly publicized at salient international platforms such as Shangri-La Dialogue, the APEC Summit, and ASEAN summits. Beijing Area Study, a public opinion poll that was carried out in the summer of 2015, ranked the Philippines the second lowest in favorability, 36 out of 100, only after Japan, 30 out of 100, against whom we know the Chinese nationalist sentiment was notoriously acute. And the Baidu Search Index offers another measurement for the level of public attention on the dispute. Baidu Search Index works similarly to Google Analytics that tracks the daily search activity on given keywords on China's most dominant search engine. And the search volume on the keywords South China Sea during the 1 year pre-crisis period was roughly about 4,000, the solid line. This is about 50% higher than the all-time average, the dotted line, that the data is available. So we have a generally hostile attitude towards the Philippines and a heightened level of attention and heightened media exposure on the South China Sea dispute, all indicating an existing hardline public opinion before the onset of the diplomatic crisis. But my interviews actually show that the state harbored a moderate foreign policy intent. My interviews with government officials and scholars close to policymaking all suggest that the leaders from the very beginning of the crisis want the issue to go away. They give very little consideration to punishing or even threatening to punish Manila. And the non-acceptance, non-participation policy was largely reactive and remedial after diplomatic efforts failed to dissuade Manila from pursuing the case. The actual policy pursued by Beijing also show that, at the height of the crisis, Beijing wasted no time in congratulating Rodrigo Duterte, who was sworn in as the Philippines' new president in the middle of the crisis. Beijing also sent delegates to meet Fidel Ramos, Philippines' former president, who's known to be more friendly to China, to mend relationship. So besides these diplomatic gestures, Beijing also made substantive concessions. At a China-ASEAN summit in July, China promised not to carry out land reclamation activities on the Scarborough Shoal. At a China-ASEAN summit in August, China made another concession of allowing the Filipino fishermen to return to the Scarborough Shoal. So all of these show that there's a gap between existing hardline public opinion and a moderate state foreign policy, that the state eventually adopted a pacification campaign to bridge this gap. And the events or the media campaign that transpired later corroborates the many symptoms of a typical pacification campaign. So first, the state made sure that the government's voice was the first heard and also the most resounding one. At every turn of events, for every piece of negative information or argument that surfaced, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson would always come out immediately, sometimes even preemptively, to respond to these remarks. And People's Daily would unfailingly publish these remarks. They echoed the public sentiment through these media campaigns with strongly worded statements. Examples include former State Councilor Yaping Wang dismissed the ruling as nothing but a piece of waste paper. The then State Councilor Yang Jiechi dismissed the arbitration as a political farce all along. My interview with the government official also corroborates that they understand the importance to resonate with the public's feelings. He said that sometimes politically correct stuff in the media is just not enough for the people. Only the language we often find in Global Times, which is a well-known hawkish newspaper under People's Daily, help the public vent their spleen. They help the people let off steam by resonating their feelings. And the hardline posturing mechanism is also corroborated. A scholar writes that the government does not want to suppress coverage too bluntly, as too little noise might make the government appear weak and easily cowed, so they don't want to appear too weak. My interview with the government official also expressed his concern with the hardline public opinion. He says the government was worried that the public might hear about the arbitration from foreign media, and this has great impact on China's national image. So China played the sheep in the wolf skin. They needed the wolf skin to protect themselves and maintain social stability. And media coverage was also particularly positive to offset some of the side effects from these negative frames, the echoing and the hardline posturing. Some of the typical positive frames include, for example, explaining and advocating for China's preference for bilateral negotiations as the preferred way to resolve the dispute, citing and enumerating the international legal experts or countries and organizations who supported China's position, and stressing on China's cooperation with multilateral organizations such as ASEAN. So all of these are quite positive. And studies also find that articles published during this period of time with positive tones exceeded those with negative tones by 25% in June. And this number rose even higher to July to 40%. They also delegitimized unhelpful emotions, such as anger and hatred. They dismissed the very few people who took it to the street or went on boycotting as having confused love for the country with blind impulses and doing damage to the country and to the society. So instead, they advocated for the kind of patriotism. They have a new definition that is civil, rational, and also in a utilitarian sense that is beneficial for the country. Lastly, letting vent. Surprisingly, that many of the state media's social media platforms were not only open, but they encouraged social media. They were filled with an outpour of public emotions on social media. And not only this, studies also find that social media posts during this period of time was particularly entertaining, curiously, and with a great number of jokes and spoofs. Examples include, for example, shopping sites called on boycotting dried mangoes made in the Philippines, and the shoppers made the shops made the claim in such a frivolous way that many netizens joked about it, or parodies using the goddess of mercy, who according to legends lived in the South China Sea, impersonating her by saying that I heard some people want to take the South China Sea from me. This entertaining nature of social media posts tell us something, that it's more for vending rather than for collective action purposes. Because otherwise, calling for actions would sound a lot more serious, right? So to conclude, the core of the misalignment argument is that closing the state-society gap matters for foreign policy execution, even for authoritarian states, through the mobilizing and the pacifying functions of media. These two functions combined provide a fuller picture of how authoritarian leaders utilize media as a tool of statecraft to serve their foreign policy needs. And another takeaway message is that the use of pacifying rhetoric is almost like an open secret among authoritarian states. As a result, in order to understand the foreign policy intentions of these states, decision makers need to recognize that these states commonly use media campaigns not to escalate, but actually to remove their domestic hurdles to de-escalate. Aggressive language should not invariably be read as escalatory. Some of the harsh language may contain nuances that are not immediately obvious. Decision makers need to understand these complex dynamics when drafting their own foreign policy responses. Last, this book also provides decision makers with social scientific tools to decode the foreign policy intentions of authoritarian states, usually leveraging open source data such as media texts. And although that we've seen that pacification campaigns and mobilization campaigns sometimes can adopt seemingly similar harsh language, but careful text analysis of state media can reveal their distinctions and provide insight into the state's foreign policy intentions. This could be particularly beneficial for leaders dealing with opaque regimes like China, where data access and transparency has always been a challenge. All right, let me end here. And
Thanks.
all right.
I'll start with a few questions. One is about the People's Daily. So whenever I talk to Chinese experts and Chinese citizens about the People's Daily and the fact that people like you and I study what's in the People's Daily, they often laugh and say, well, no one reads the People's Daily except for the Communist Party chiefs. And my response to them is always, and I want to get your reaction to it, is that all the other media outlets that you actually read get the People's Daily and see that as the kind of standard setter for what their coverage. So what's in the People's Daily is influential, even if people don't pick up the People's Daily itself, because the things they do pick up are influenced by the People's Daily. Is that right? Or
Yes.
am I just making stuff up?
No, you're actually answering your own question.
No, but I just don't know. I believe it, but I haven't studied it like you have. So
Okay.
I want to know whether my response is correct.
Both the critique about People's Daily and your answer to that is correct. The
Okay.
People's Daily is really, it's so units in the government that they subscribe to People's Daily, they were sent automatically copies of People's Daily, but no one on the street reads.
Yeah, you never see it
Daily.
on the train. You don't see someone reading the People's
Right.
Daily, but the people at the Global Times and all these other newspapers get the People's Daily, and they see what it means,
Right.
what they're being told to
So
do.
these professionals,
Yeah.
media workers, that they read it, and they make sure that they don't stray away from People's Daily. So that's the main reason I'm adopting People's Daily as a predictor of Chinese state media. And another reason is just realistically that this is the longest existing Chinese state media. It came into being since 1947. Some of the cases are 1951. So
Yeah.
CCTV is pretty, I can use CCTV
Yeah, people watch that.
transcripts,
Yeah.
but CCTV rarely reports on, they usually just copies the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson's remarks, and they really have any commentaries. So People's Daily actually is a better source. But for some of the more recent cases, I do have a examination of other sources as supplementary materials.
Okay, so then the second question I have is about not drumming up emotions or tamping down emotions, because the good thing about your book is you talk about both, that they sometimes drum up emotions to get people excited about a problem. Sometimes they tamp it down, like you offered here. But just hiding stuff entirely from the public. So what comes to mind is 2020 with India. There was a clash and people got killed. And in almost none of the cases that you have, except when you go back to the 1988, did anyone actually get hurt? Like there's tension, but no one really got hurt. And in this case, I don't know how many Chinese soldiers were killed, but dozens of people died and some on both sides. Is it Doklam? Is that the proper? Yeah.
17 is 2017 is Doklam.
No, Galwan.
2020 is that's different location. 2017 is Doklam.
But 2020 is
Galwan.
Galvan is where the deaths were. Yeah, so the 2020 is where the deaths was. Doklam was early. You're right. Okay, so Doklam in 2020. I don't recall that even appearing in the Chinese media that there were casualties, which is consistent with the idea that they want to tamp things down. But it seems of a different nature.
Right.
Like the facts aren't even out there.
Yes. So typical way to tamp down is through censorship.
Yeah.
But in modern times, with the advent of the internet, social media, it becomes increasingly difficult.
Yeah.
It's only possible. So on Sino-Japan, Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, these more inflammatory disputes, it was still possible in 1978. There were a fleet of over 100 ships surfacing in the sea that the People's Daily were able just to cover it up and cause an entire blackout of the news.
Yeah.
On China-India border dispute, there's that's also possible, which is less inflammatory, like compared to Taiwan or compared to Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. But they also have to do some of the very tricky things that, so that's why I argue that censorship now, that because it's not powerful enough to use alone, they have to couple it with these pacification campaigns. And they have to couple it, say, with techniques just making it possible, but at the end of the list. So say if you do a search, there's a long list that you have to click, like next, and then you find the news, right? It's not censored, but it's just less available. It makes more efforts, requires more efforts to access to these information. But at the end of the day, average people, they don't. I
just a personal story. I was in China in 1996 during the Senkaku Diaoyu crisis. There was a little.
What year?
July 96. There was a little crisis compared to not as big as the ones in 2012.
Right.
But
actually have
the students at the universities wanted to go and protest outside the Japanese embassy in Beijing.
Right.
And the deans were told to keep them in the dorms. They didn't want them going downtown.
Oh, wow.
It was pretty close. It was only 7 years after Tiananmen. So the argument that a military officer said to me was the first day they'll go down to the Japanese embassy and complain about Japan. The second day they'll complain about the Chinese government for being too weak on Japan. And the third day they'll just complain about the Chinese government, forget all about Japan. That's what he told me in an interview. So he said, I understand why they did it, but the way they did it is consistent with they recognized the anger. And then they said, if you really want to be patriotic, study hard. so like take all your anger and put it into your studies and you'll make this nation stronger and Japan will never mess with us again.
But your description is quite useful in saying that the Chinese government is aware that some of the target might turn to the
it's May 4th,
right? It's
May 4th. So yeah. Anyway, and then the last thing is the Philippines, and I'll turn it over to other people. In the Philippines, I wonder how much of that case that you laid out so well is determined by the election of Duterte. Mm-hmm. In other words, there was increasing tension with the Philippines. The Philippines were absolutely successful in that arbitral dispute. They won almost every aspect of the case. China was really upset. But then there was suddenly a Filipino leader who is fundamentally different than the previous one and who was relatively soft on China and publicly saying, I'm not going to risk railroad investment for rocks and reefs. You know,
Right.
he was kind of playing down the disputes. So I just wonder how much of that pacification was driven by that fact and how much of it was driven by their normal behavior.
The moderate foreign policy, I think it showed intentions at the very beginning of the crisis, because there's no better way to do this. In the previous crisis, the 2013 Scarborough Shoal, that's where
It
do I
was
have it?
2012, 2013.
2012.
Yeah.
I'm not
It lasted almost a year. Yeah.
right here.
Yeah.
So this one at the bottom of the hawkish hardline, that
Mhm.
China adopted a hardline foreign policy.
Yeah.
And that failed. And as a result of the Scarborough Shoal incident, actually, that China, so Philippines initiated arbitration case.
Yeah.
And I see the election of Rodrigo Duterte played an important part, but it's only one of those instances that proved useful for the Chinese government. So they are looking for opportunities to get out of this abyss. If there's no opportunity here, they would look for other opportunities. So eventually they might find an opportunity, but it just become realized in this way that Rodrigo Duterte's election made it to the one opportunity.
Well, I don't want to dominate the whole question, so I'm done with my questions. And other people, thanks for the thought.
I'm just curious, in terms of the government's method for assessing or measuring alignment and misalignment, how was that being conducted, or was it, consistent across different governments or countries?
To my surprise, to my interviews, during my interviews with media, government officials, and actually also confirming some of the readings in authoritarian public opinion, authoritarian leaders pay close attention to gauging public opinion from time to time. In my interviews to People's Daily journalists and editors, and also China Daily, that they say their functions, like written functions, not only they are the eyes and ears for the party, they are not only the voice of the party, they're also the eyes and the ears for the party. So meaning that they also gauge public opinion and write internal reports back to their superiors and report on, so what's the public opinion on this issue. And they also hire professional companies to gauge public opinion both online and through these internally available public opinion polls, which are usually not available to the public. So they take serious approaches to gauge public opinion. And I would say they're, like from Mao period, they say there's, people's approach, right? So they take people seriously because now, especially as the fading of ideology as source for legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party, that they take nationalism and legitimacy, people's recognition, even, I wouldn't say arguably more seriously than democracies, but they take it very seriously too. Do I call these people wherever the microphone is? Yeah.
Okay, so one quick question: how did you measure the existing public opinion? Because I didn't see that on the slides. Maybe I missed it.
Right.
And because it's very clear the state policy, but not the public opinion.
There are many ways. So mainly how public opinion is perceived, how public opinion is measured, and how public opinion is used. Because there's a lack of data on many of these cases, so it poses challenges that I can't find consistent measures across the cases. But fortunately for many of the earlier cases, that the 50, 60 cases, that the public didn't know much about these disputes at all, so automatically weak public opinion. But for data that's available, that I could deduce public opinion from the archives and interviews, because it's more important how the state leaders perceive public opinion to be. So that's the perceived misalignment or alignment, right? And then secondary sources and how typically public opinion can be measured. Sometimes public opinion surveys are available right before, like in this case, right before the onset of the crisis, or Baidu Search Index can offer a measurement for the level of public attention not necessarily how public thinks, but at least we know whether public is paying attention, salience of the issues. And most of the time I can deduce, right? So if the public didn't know much, this is not a quite prevalent foreign policy issue at the time, then it's weak public opinion. And nowadays more social media, but I have to tease out the genuine public opinion, and that's the difficulty. So what is genuine public opinion? What is not? What is state motivated public opinion? And I try to, like the 1996 student movement, the Senkaku Diaoyu Island. I actually interviewed for the 2005 Senkaku Diaoyu Island. I interviewed some of my classmates in Beijing University. They participated. They did master's program, so they participated in the demonstrations. They tell me as a participant whether it's genuine or not. So this is some of the ways I get like past the problem of whether this is genuine.
In Japan, it's pretty easy to say it's genuine, right? It's
right,
constant in Japan.
But sometimes even participants would tell me that the state not only allow it, they would encourage them to go. And then you can tell this is a little obscure whether it's state sponsored or it's genuine.
I saw genuine. I went to the 2004 Asia's Cup final match in Beijing between Japan and China in 2004. I went to the stadium to the game.
Oh, okay.
And Japan won on a controversial call.
Wow, you were there?
And yeah, and the crowd went nuts. I mean, it was spontaneous. It was real. And the government did not like it.
Yes. So many of these, fortunately, many of these cases, these sources of information, so basically crisscross with each other, and they rarely contradict each other.
Okay. I have another question, but I don't know. There are also a lot of questions
We
in
can
the
circle
public.
around
Yeah,
and
exactly.
come back.
And then after.
Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating presentation. I was wondering if while you were working on this topic, you thought at all about the ways in which this theoretical framework could be abstracted to talk about Chinese campaign style governance more generally, and the ways in which the sort of alignment of public opinion and policy intention could be applied to sort of domestically focused campaigns, either rhetorical ones like criticize Lin Biao, criticize Confucius, or more ones that are oriented towards policy goals, like anti-corruption campaigns?
This is actually one of the very rare questions that I've come across as new. I've given this talk many times.
Yeah.
This is a new question, but the campaign style, which is, I think, could trace back to the Soviet style, that they are very typical Soviet style domestic campaigns, like one-child policy or against the Falun Gong. I remember I was in China that every day, or the Tiananmen, you call it massacre or whatever, that I was child in Beijing, that every day we hear in the news, it was just around the clock, just this. So it's a campaign. And this is very typical. So this actually, let me think whether these media campaigns could apply similarly to other authoritarian states who don't have as heavy a Soviet influence. Most of the applicable cases extending to other authoritarian states, I would think just are popular authoritarian states, as described by Popular Authoritarianism and Moraine Brady's work, or Levitsky and Wei, competitive authoritarian countries that have superficial democratic election type of authoritarian states. So I wouldn't say that's limited to Soviet style or Soviet former communist countries, but that's quite an interesting perspective to look at this. And these media campaigns are domestic media campaigns, just on foreign policy issues. So that could be used very well to study campaign style domestic policies.
Thank you. So in the case of Philippines that you illustrated, it was a case where the public attention was already there and pretty nationalistic before the media campaign started.
Right.
But if in any case, if the media campaign was already escalatory, and then they suddenly wanted to change back to pacifying, would that pose an issue when it comes to sort of consistency in messaging, so the credibility of media campaigns messages?
Right. That's a very good question. I get a lot, because these cases are not independent from each other. This would be a problem if I'm doing large N analysis, right? You have to have independence of the cases. So for example, the case I mentioned, the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident was a precedent, set up the precedent for the 2016, where is it? 2016, here, arbitration case, right? So what you have here that increased public opinion, it starts the onset of the crisis here, explains the existing hardline public opinion here. So it won't be a problem if I'm doing process tracing, because the cutoff timeline is a beginning of a crisis and at the end of the crisis that you have existing public opinion that starts before the response of the state. So the state would always come after, so as the response to the existing public opinion. So it's very important in these case studies or process tracing that I make sure the sequencing of the events because there's a feedback loop, right? So a previous, the public opinion or media policy in the previous crisis would have impact on public opinion or state policy in the next crisis. But if you separate out and tease out this particular crisis, and that wouldn't be such a problem. But I was very careful in my case analysis to explain, where that public opinion comes from. Let's get to the other side of the room, and then we'll circle back. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Did you find like a difference in how readily certain, I guess, administrations in the CCP or certain foreign ministers or presidents use these media campaigns, or was it generally the same amount of usage across the board, or did one more readily deploy these campaigns earlier or relied on them more, or was it generally the same level of reliance of this tool?
I didn't find quite a difference in between these different presidencies, but I did find a time association with different types of media campaigns. As you can see, this quadrant are with the dovish, weak public opinion, but hardline state foreign policy. These are mobilization campaigns. And the mobilization campaigns are mostly happening before 1991. And here are the pacification campaigns. Pacification campaigns are mostly after 1990s. So this suggests to us that pacification campaigns is more a contemporary phenomenon. And in the book, I set up the scope conditions for the pacification campaigns. First, you have to incur a cost for unsupported foreign policy. If you can implement a foreign policy that deviates from public opinion or public preference without punishment, then you wouldn't have to pacify. You wouldn't have to launch these media campaigns at all. And then another thing is that censorship doesn't work by its own anymore. So you have to add something stronger or more. And this corresponds to contemporary time setting, right? And also the rise of nationalism is another condition, that because that there's rising nationalism in many of these contemporary authoritarian states, that you need something stronger to deal with the nationalism, to pacify them, not simply by clamping down and suppressing through censorship. So there's a time association. And the mobilization campaign is typical during the Mao period because most of the harsh or hardline foreign policy was pursued during the Mao period. And many of these territorial disputes was not known to the public, so public opinion was weak. So which is very typical setup for the mobilization campaigns in this quadrant.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I think I have to get the book now after listening to this.
Yes.
And I had a question regarding, I see that a lot of these cases are more restricted to specific foreign policy and territorial disputes. But I was wondering within your own research if you see that there's a similar mechanism insofar as the state's reaction and its misalignment with public opinion within foreign economic crises, like a trade war with the U.S. or something within that sense.
Yes, I haven't. Yes, I haven't done systematic research onto these subjects, but because of this book, I've been observing what's happening right now. I feel like that there's been both mobilization campaigns and pacification campaigns, but play out at different occasions. So I have a paper in ISQ International Studies Quarterly with Andrew Chubb, a previous fellow at the China the World program, that we actually reconcile our different arguments for the same research question and argue that in the South China Sea arbitration case, that there's both mobilization and pacification. It's like a wave or a cycle that the state likes to use mobilization at the beginning of a crisis to sort of using it as the audience cost argument. Audience cost type of argument. These are undergraduate students or graduate students?
Everybody.
Okay.
But they know what audience cost arguments
Okay.
And Jessica Chan Weiss, they know.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So you use sort of an audience cost to enhance your coercive power leverage towards a foreign country. So like now China, the US is not talking, and it's mostly mobilization and saying that our people are behind us, and we do this for our people, right? To sort of increase our leverage in the possible negotiation down the road. And then once negotiation starts, they started to pacify. They started to make sure that the public will be supportive for whatever deal that comes along. And they won't become a trouble or obstacle for a peace deal or a deal that come along. So this is like almost like a cycle that first mobilize, and then for audience cost type of or signaling in Andrew Chubb's wordings, and then pacify. And some other cases, I could also extend. So Nancy Pelosi's visit, Taiwan, so typical pacifying.
Yeah, because the people wanted blood.
Or at the beginning, before the visit, they tried to use, but it was very short, a little bit mobilizing to prevent Nancy Pelosi from or persuade her from to change her opinion from coming. But once the visit was made, it turned into pacification because the state couldn't launch a war. So, but people wanted blood, so they need to pacify. The most recent mobilizing is I can think it's the THAAD issue.
Yeah, I don't think regular people cared about that.
Right, and then the state actually felt a substantial threat from the THAAD, and then they mobilized this and made it a big deal into that. So I would guess that would be
needed people to boycott. So
right.
Part of the sanctions, the boycott.
That would be an exception to so I would have a contemporary case here in the mobilization case cluster. But the reason I focus on territorial disputes is just because it's very manipulatable, very inflammatory, and that presents the easy, just single type of disputes that's really easy to get into it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic lecture. I want to draw you back to the Sino-Indian border dispute and the media campaigns around that, particularly to compare the 2017 one, which you have researched on, as well as the 2020 one, which you've not spoken about, but I hope you've looked at. Based on my own firsthand experience from Beijing at that point, the sense that I got was that the 2017 in general, I find that for the Sino-Indian border dispute, the average public don't really care that much until it becomes a media issue. And so, which is why I'm not entirely convinced that we can put it in the hawkish public opinion bracket for 2017, because I believe that the hawkishness was generated partly by the Chinese media campaign itself. And when I compare that to my experience in 2020, I saw what I believe much more resolute, measured, and subdued Chinese media campaign as opposed to 2017. And I was just wondering how that fits into your analysis of Chinese media campaigns.
At the beginning of this 2017, the cutoff line was of the book was 2017, and I had to add it to my dissertation last minute. And lots of things wasn't spanning out yet while I was writing the dissertation. But now that I think some of the case, the 2017 that I regarded as the pacification campaign, where a hardline public opinion was mainly, yes, I agree with you, with the media. And some of these media could be state-sponsored or from Western media that were translated or transferred into domestic domain. So I guess part of it was genuine, that this is responsive to this because of the getting over the Great Firewall, and people have access to these foreign information, and that inflamed the public to some extent.
Thank you.
Hi, I want to say thank you first, and I'm wondering your insights on the difference between the political elite's opinion and the mass opinions in both China and America, because I write content for both the policy academia and the mass public in China and America, and that like what I write for them is like not the same type of style and content. And like it's also in the West, like there are also diverse opinions. For example, James Borton, because since we're talking about the South China Sea, he just invited me to collaborate with him on South China Sea Newswire. And his new book, Harvesting the Wave, challenges the conventional Western view on how Beijing is depicted on South China Sea, which is, like, for example, contrasting with Gregory Polling's On Dangerous Ground. And since I had the opportunity to engage with both of them, I found that there are diverse opinions among the policy and academia makers and among the mass people, like not only in China, but also in the West. So since you are having so much knowledge about like the public opinion, I'm wondering what's your thoughts on these differences or contrasts between the political elites and the mass opinion? What causes that? And what are the similarities and differences between the Chinese and America in terms of this contrast?
Right. So the theory in itself needs to be simple. So that's the limitations of the theory, that I don't differentiate between elite opinion and general public opinion. But in the book, whenever I have an opportunity, that I do discuss about some of these elite opinions and general public, and I get into the literature on authoritarian public opinion, especially authoritarian states have to care both about elite opinion and public opinion. Public opinion for more legitimacy reasons and performance reasons, and also elite opinion because elite tend to be the most vocal, and that the group of people who will likely to take actions that will hurt the stability and regime survival. So in the discussion, I do discuss about these details, but the theory itself, because to be succinct, that I have to divide it into like a binary, hawkish or dovish, and then the state foreign policy intent also, that the 2x2 table you saw earlier, that either it's hardline or a moderate state foreign policy. But in the Mediaman study here, that some of the cases I do discuss about nuanced changes. So say some cases like the Sino-Soviet border war, that because Soviets threatened to use nuclear weapons on China. So that's the one rare case where China's foreign policy changed from hardline to moderate. Or several, the 2010 and 2012, Sino-Japanese over Senkaku Diaoyu Island, the foreign policy also changed from at the beginning more moderate to a hard line, especially so say the fishing trawler incident or the purchasing of the Senkaku Diaoyu Island, the nationalization of these, once it's becoming realized, these purchases, that the state foreign policy starts to change from moderate to more hardline. And this, I was able to capture a little bit, but for the theoretical simplifying purposes, that I was not able to. But I'm glad that I got an opportunity to talk about the differences between elite and why authoritarian states will have to cater to both elite opinion and general public opinion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'll put your book on my summer reading list.
Oh, great.
So,
Yeah.
yes. So I wanted to ask about Taiwan and whether, because I mean, all of these are bilateral disputes, and if I'm correct, the Chinese government recognizes them as bilateral disputes. But with Taiwan, of course, there's a complete denial that it's a bilateral dispute in any way. Is the framing of these sort of campaigns different with regards to Taiwan than with these that are currently on the board? Thank you.
Because Taiwan is right now a part of core interest together with Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. So I exclude Taiwan as sort of a interstate dispute because I see Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang as sort of an intrastate dispute. And the level of the Chinese willing to use force is much more higher than these interstate disputes. That's why I didn't include Taiwan as a case. And your question is about the bilateral or non-bilateral framing of the Taiwan issue?
If it's framed differently, for example, that if China wanted to moderate public opinion towards Taiwan or ramp up public opinion towards Taiwan, is that different in any way than when they want to do those actions with regard to the bilateral disputes on the board?
Right. The book doesn't talk about this, but I would think it's similar because the Sino-Philippines arbitration case, there's 3 actors. The US is actually a case too, we're an actor in that case too. And the 3 actors on the Taiwan issue as well, that some of the rhetoric is against Taiwan, or some of the rhetoric is against the US. So Nancy Pelosi's visit, which I see very interesting, that some of the blame are on Taiwan, but not on the US. And I guess Taiwan here is considered to be a weaker party here, that it's easier for you to blame Taiwan than blaming the US, right? And here the KFC protest against KFC happened in the Sino-Philippines arbitration case. That China also blamed the US of supporting the Philippines in the arbitration case. So it's framed not as a multilateral issue, but the media sometimes targets at a US or targets at Philippines. And many articles talk about these relevant parties all together in one article as well.
Thank you.
Hi, a lot of the questions I had in mind have already been addressed, and I wanted to ask your opinion on one thing. You talked about how you see the effect of mobilization and pacification, and I wanted to ask if you saw that in the DIU Sensaku Island case in 2010, 2012. I don't recall exactly, but I remember that in 2012, some of my friends that had Japanese cars in Beijing, for example, they became quite afraid of the people like throwing the cars like upside down. Like there were some cases like that in the streets. And yeah, at the same time, we got the impression that in the beginning, people were being actually mobilized to react. Like some people made jokes that even the stones were being put on the on the floor, like in front of the Japanese embassy in Beijing, to make it easier for people to protest against that. But after it became more violent, we have the impression that there was a complete change of course. So I wanted to hear your views about that. And then the second question will be, what are the channels that are used for this communication with the people, either to mobilize or to pacify? Like, is it mostly like social media, or as Professor was talking about, like the People's Daily, that not most people will not read the People's Daily. So how do they send these messages on concrete ways to the population? Thank you.
These are great questions. So I do have the 2010 is the fishing trawler incident that the Japanese Coast Guard arrested a fishing crew, and the fishing captain was kept arrested and tried under the Japanese domestic law. And then the 2012 is the nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. This is actually 40 or 50 years anniversary, so 1972. This is 40 years anniversary for the normalization of China-Japan relationship. So that tells me that at the beginning of the crisis, China had moderate foreign policy intention towards Japan. Many activities of celebration of the anniversary was planned that was canceled because of this. So it wasn't really planned. But as you said, as Professor Christensen mentioned earlier, that it's always easy to have hawkish public opinion on these Senkaku Diaoyu Island issues. Yes.
No
right.
one cares about the islands.
Yes. Right. Yes. But I do see pacification campaigns mainly playing out, and these stars meaning that the campaigns are borderline campaigns. So there's certain constraints it's not an all out that we see about the Falun Gong or about the Tiananmen incident or massacre. It was you see some constraints that and in my interviews, for example, in the Sino-Vietnamese oil rig crisis 2014, that although was dovish or moderate, that there's censorship. At the same time, that I interviewed a Global Times journalist that they received specific guidelines or directives from the superiors saying that you need to change the wording of your headlines, where play it down a little bit, like words like this. So that
did they report the killings in Vietnam?
Yes, and especially with the inflammatory language at the beginning, and then they were sent. Yes, right.
They killed these poor guys from Taiwan.
Yes. And they reported on it without reservations at the beginning, and then they received directives from the, say, the Department of the Propaganda or Publicity. Yes, and then but they were asked to tune it down a little bit, tune down their coverage a little bit. So these are borderline media campaigns that shows that although that we do see a pacification campaign, but there are some nuances. But the overall point of the Medium Congress test is just to, I don't want to read too much into these codings. So the point here is just to evaluate the overall plausibility of theory before we get into the process tracing of the detailed cases. And I like the second question. It's actually, so we mentioned about People's Daily not being read by average people, but all the media, major state media, and even commercial media, they follow this line. And the people read these commercial media or read these other state media, and social media as letting vent functions on in the pacification campaign, and that's made possible on social media. Many of these state media has their social media platforms. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the bottom left of your 2x2, where there's alignment and there's hawkishness and a hardline foreign policy. It seemed to me there's another maybe interesting puzzle here of biting but without barking. And so I'm curious, like, why don't we see as much coverage or propaganda around these issue areas where it seems like it's safe? Maybe there's no need to mobilize. Is it just that there are constraints in terms of, the capacity of the front page of the People's Daily, or there's other risks to do, overdoing so? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the difference there might be as opposed to the top right
this one
corner.
Here.
Mm-hmm.
But did you say barking without biting or barking?
Biting without barking. So there's a hardline foreign policy, but there don't seem to be a lot of propaganda campaigns.
Biting without barking. Right. So these are the bolded, these three cases are the deviant cases that turn out to be the exceptions. So basically what I did in the medium and test is that based on the theory, so I make judgments. So to make it more rigorous, I sent these case study narratives to country experts to have them agree on basically the narratives of these cases. And then I code these cases based on a coding book, and I code separately with two other coders Then I have them read the narratives as well and the code and achieve at least 80% agreement between us. And then, so we code these cases the state foreign policy intent and existing public opinion. And based on the theory's prediction, we predict whether there will be a media campaign or no media campaign based on misalignment, right? And then we also code the actual outcome based on the, there are criteria how I define media campaigns. So arbitrary. So I have to have 2 front page articles per month and 10 irrelevant articles per month to meet the threshold to be a media campaign. There's like in my appendix, there's more detailed coding to how to qualify as a media campaign. And then I analyze some of the borderline media campaigns as well. So these 3 cases are the deviant cases. And you can see, back to your question, that 2 of these 3 cases are deviant cases. So this is actually one of the quadrant that's the most problematic. Yes.
Why are they? They're both hawkish, so there's no need for a campaign, right?
Right. So in principle, there should be no campaigns. But the problem with this is that the Sino-Vietnamese border war in the larger context already has a border campaign, already has a media campaign.
For 1988, there was a bloodshed in that.
Yes.
The Vietnamese were driven off.
Right. So according to my theory, there's alignment, right? On the 1988, there should be no media campaign. But in fact, there is, because it's part of the larger context of the 10-year China-Vietnam border war.
Oh, I see.
So there were already lots of talking there too. And then the other one, this one, it's actually, there's a media campaign, but there's a borderline media campaign. And I argue that this is actually one of the typical audience cost argument, that maybe you can see this as audience cost as well. But I didn't get into the detail, like to proving audience cost. But I do show that because of the nature of the borderline media campaign, that shows nuances in the conditions for audience cost argument. So if this is the most problematic, this could be mostly explained by the audience cost or signaling argument. So this shows just equal finality, right? Different theories can explain the same result, showing that part of my theory is only one of the ways to explain media campaigns or their absence.
Thank you so much. Hi, thank you for the sharing. I was wondering if you have any insights about how China balances such domestic media campaigns with the messaging that it wants to convey to the international community. For example, Philippines might receive these more aggressive messaging that's put out on Chinese media, and it kind of runs counter to the more moderate state policy that China wants to employ with Philippines.
Right. That's a great question. So there's always a concern for foreign governments to misread this, right? That's part of the policy implications of the study, to shed light for the decision makers to read the internet in the foreign policy intentions of authoritarian states better. But it's always possible for the foreign governments to misread this and interpret the pacification campaign to be aggressive. But there are ways for states to achieve to control the ramifications of the pacification campaigns. So, for example, that there's credible private channels, like how think tanks used to be in DC, that they can.
Well, we had them.
Right, we had them. That I used to work in one, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
It's still there.
Right, and my boss, Douglas Paul, at the time, he was the American Taiwan Institute director. Yes, and since he worked at Carnegie, that he's functioned as, sending these private credible information, and to say this is not our intention, right? The same applies to the Chinese meaning, and also there's language barrier. Domestic media, these are domestic media campaigns. Although things are more and more translated into English, but not entirely, right? And also maybe contribution partly from this book that helps states to read foreign policy intentions of authoritarian states better so that they don't misread this. But in the end, I think the very appearances where adoption of these media campaigns, pacification campaigns, show that the authoritarian leaders think the risk and costs can be outweighed by the benefits. So that's why that they're adopting these pacification campaigns.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm a Vietnamese national, so this question is gonna be a little bit personal to me.
Okay.
So I went through like the whole state education in Vietnam. So and like I lived there, so I understand, you know, the sentiment of Vietnamese people, the public toward China, the xenophobic. But because I don't have like access to like China social media or anything, and aside from the border conflict in '79, I really don't understand, you know, the sentiment that, you know, Chinese public have for Vietnam, why like during like in your bar chart, Vietnam plays so low in the sentiment of Chinese people.
Right.
Like what's what's the root of that like, you know, such negative sentiment for Vietnam?
So before '79, the Chinese people view Vietnam as their brothers, and China and Vietnam enjoyed a quite good relationship. As the relationship deteriorated, and they see Vietnam as having a closer relationship with Soviet Union, and they see more threat from Vietnam, and that sentiment started to change, especially from the top. And then they started to, and then there's a mistreatment of Chinese people along the border,
Okay.
right? That were brought up at the UN court several times, and complaint by the Chinese embassy repeatedly. And so the Chinese media started to paint Vietnam as not appreciating the Chinese help during the Vietnam War and betraying their friendship, and that reversed. So, but because the media campaign took at least, you know, almost a decade, so that was contributing to the reversal of Chinese public opinion a lot. And I do utilize the Sino-Vietnamese oil rig crisis 2014, and I get to the Vietnamese side of the story to as another pacification case, because in this case, China tried to shut it down and didn't have a media campaign. As I said, the Global Times received directives not to cover this too much. But the Vietnamese public opinion on this is actually, this case would be placed here. The Vietnamese side of the case would be placed here. The Vietnamese public, as you may well know, the Vietnamese public were worked up on this. They were very upset about this.
You remember that?
Yes, I was there. I was there at the time, and there were kids in my school, like they're like Chinese descent. I was a kid, like I was primary school, but then there was kids in my school that, you know, Chinese descent. They wouldn't like, their parent wouldn't let them to go to school because they were fear that, you know, their kid would, you know, be bullied. But you know, they were like the Hoa people. They lived there just for so long, but they still being like called like not real Vietnamese.
Right.
So yeah.
But at the time, on the Vietnamese side of the story, the Vietnamese government initiated a similar pacification campaign, similar to what we observed in the Sino-Philippines arbitration case, what the Chinese government did.
And I think it started after this Taiwan citizenship bill.
Not only Singaporean, or because East Asian, it's hard. Sorry, East Asians are hard to distinguish, right?
I don't know if the Taiwanese were of Chinese descent. If you're Vietnamese, and you could tell they were Chinese, right? So that was it was ethnic anger.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
So, but I think the government was freaked out by that. Like, you know,
Not only tarnish.
Vietnam wanted a good relationship with Taiwan, and they also didn't want to totally spoil their relationship with China.
Right. Because not only threatens the regime stability, but also tarnish the international image of Vietnam and damages the future investments foreign investments in Vietnam, right? So all these are serious concerns that the Vietnamese government needs to take care of.
Thank you.
US.
No.
Pure US.
No territorial dispute between China and the US.
No, but yeah, but not there's got to be more than territorial disputes. I just wonder what your views on certain things are. So I just think of U.S. cases in the past. There was the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and I heard all sorts of stories about what happened. That there was like a real popular explosion against the U.S. because an embassy was blown up and people were killed. But that the Chinese government very quickly kind of organized and channeled the protests, so that it was a weird combination where there was real spontaneous anger, like some Canadian guy was beaten up because he was mistaken for an American in Haidian, like just beaten up on the street. And that wasn't like government control, that was just people being angry. And then people went down to the US embassy to attack it, but apparently the Chinese government very quickly organized phases where, you know, a group of students would come from one university on a bus, and they would all have rocks, and it was their turn, and they would go up to the U.S. embassy and throw their rocks, and then they'd say, okay, you're done, you know, next, and then another group. So it was this weird combination of like spontaneous anger and communist social control.
I actually show students in my China foreign relations class a video of people chanting for a group of people throwing rocks at the American cars, the embassy cars.
Yeah.
And I show pictures of how the embassy was defaced, the building was defaced.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Sasser, the U.S.
James Sasser,
was stuck in the embassy for
you saw the picture of him looking at him.
right. Just surviving on the dried biscuits.
That's and chocolate bars. And chocolate bars.
But that's a typical, and I would think that's a typical cycle. At the beginning, just utilize the worked up nationalism as a leverage for negotiations. But once negotiations start, gets into the phase of pacifying. To make sure that whatever deal that's reached is supported by the public and doesn't go away.
The other example is EP3, right? 2001. So that was misreported because it was sincerely misreported by the Chinese government, because the Chinese leaders thought that the US plane had hit the Chinese plane, and they later discovered that it was the reverse because it was explained to them. But they had already put it into the press that the US plane had hit a Chinese plane.
Right. I haven't done a systematic media study of these media reports, but I
just wonder if
guesses.
I'm interested. I don't know the answers, but I do know that Jiang Zemin himself thought that the U.S. plane had rammed the Chinese plane until the U.S. ambassador to China, who is a naval aviator, explained to Jiang Zemin why that was physically impossible, and that his military was lying to him.
And the impeccable.
Impeccable was
9.
Impeccable was 2009. But that was not a big public thing. The U.S. made that public. So Oriana Mastro was one of my students. She wrote about an article about the impeccable thing. And my impression was the Chinese government didn't want that to go public. They harassed the ship. They didn't want it to go public. And the U.S. complained about it publicly. And then they had no choice.
Interesting. I interviewed Paul Henley, was in the government. And I forgot what he said. I didn't get into the but that would be.
I think the U.S. went public and complained, and China wanted to keep it quiet. Anyway. Another one? We're at 6 o'clock. Oh, we're at 6 o'clock? We feeding people?
I mean, it's up to you. I'm just saying.
It's up to me whether there is food? All right, one more question and then we'll eat.
Okay, I'll be quick then. Like, since we're talking about like US China cases about the public opinion, even though there's no territory dispute right now, there's tech rivalry happening on Taiwan. For example, like I was just writing this research paper about the Taiwan semiconductor industry's geopolitical interest in between China, US tech rivalry for Professor Anatole class, even though he has just left. Yeah, like he just left. But the thing is, I was saying that like I also had a research about like public opinion and the high profile scholars' opinion in China and Americas different talks about like the Taiwan semiconductor, because China has the ambition to have more ownership and control about the semiconductor. So they would frame something like Taiwan is part of theirs, or like the mainland needs to do more by themselves. But America, like they do it in a different way. They have this soft pressure on semiconductor industry. And I just talked with Peter Cleveland, who is a senior vice president of the TSMC, and he just had a post about how this Arizona like manufacturing of the semiconductor was like aligning with President Trump's call for national security. And I quoted that in my research paper after I met him. But I think that doesn't always represent the public opinion. That might be more diplomatic and like on the political elite side. But still, that political or like policy business elite are influencing the public opinion. So I still think it's relevant. So through this kind of tech rivalry, through a disputed island or a disputed territory, I can still see there are differences between the existing public opinion, just to like as a complementary comment to your discussion.
But there's another layer in this is the foreign influence campaigns that target at foreign audiences. This book focuses on domestic public opinion, domestic media campaigns. I have started working on my next book that I'm going to China, foreign influence campaigns, and particularly the type where the Chinese has a deeper pocket that they outsource and pay for these local agents to do China's bidding on their behalf. So this summer I'm going to China and Taiwan. This is a quite sensitive topic.
Yeah, we all need this because it has to be done systematically. Everyone's talking about it, but no one knows what they're talking about.
There are lots of studies by think tanks
but
on
they're not
foreign
really
influence
careful.
campaigns.
I think you'll do a better job.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Anyway, let's thank our speaker and we can have.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the great question.